Welcome to Breaking News to Trading Moves. Today we're looking at some new friction in U.S.-China trade, specifically some new port fees going back and forth. Our goal here is to map out how this affects shipping, logistics, the whole supply chain, really. We want to pinpoint which companies might benefit and, which ones could face some headwinds.
That's right. The headline here is China putting a new charge on American ships starting October 14th. And this mirrors a fee the U.S. already has on vessels linked to China.
Sure.
So the bottom line is it adds costs, and it adds a layer of uncertainty to shipping across the Pacific.
Right, a tit-for-tat thing with these fees. Okay,
Yeah.
Can you break down the specifics? What exactly is China implementing here?
Sure. It's a fee of 400 yuan. That's roughly 56 US dollars per net ton of the ship, and it's applied per voyage.
Per voyage, okay.
Yeah. And it targets ships that are U.S. owned, operated, flagged, or even U.S. built. But the key part, like you said, is the scope. It also catches entities where there's a U.S. ownership stake of 25% or more.
So just changing the flag isn't enough. That 25% rule means you have to look at who actually owns or controls the vessel.
Exactly. It prevents, easy workarounds.
And this is the direct response to the U.S. fee.
Correct. It's very similar to the U.S. fee, which is $50 per net ton on ships connected to China. And you also have to remember this is happening alongside other U.S. actions like tariffs on Chinese-made ship-to-shore cranes and some cargo equipment.
Okay, so it's a multi-pronged thing. Costs are going up for carriers linked to either country if they're calling at the other's ports.
That's the situation, yeah.
All right, so let's pivot to the market impact. If the usual ways get more expensive or, less predictable, some alternatives start looking better. Let's start with the winners list companies that might gain from this.
Okay, well, often the first place people look when ocean shipping gets disrupted is air cargo.
Makes sense. If ocean freight gets pricier or maybe just less reliable because of these fees, delays, complications, whatever, then urgent shipments look for speed.
That's the classic adjustment, yes.
Yes?
If you have high-value goods, things that need to arrive now, you might shift them to air.
So that could mean more volume, maybe better pricing power for air freight companies.
Potentially, yes. We'd look at the big players with global networks. Think FDX, that's FDX.
Okay.
And UPS. It's not just the $56 fee itself, which might seem small next to air freight costs, but it's the unreliability factor it introduces for things like high-end electronics, certain car parts, pharmaceuticals. That lack of predictability can force a shift to air.
Got it. Okay, what's next on the potential winners list? Sticking with shipping.
Yeah, let's stay with ocean shipping for a moment, but look at capacity that's not directly tied to the U.S. or China.
Neutrality plays.
Kind of, yeah.
So,
When you have these kinds of disputes, shippers start looking to, let's say, de-risk their supply chains. If Chinese ships face U.S. fees and U.S.-linked ships face these new Chinese fees, maybe you look for a carrier from, Singapore or Denmark, or maybe a lesser based elsewhere.
so companies listed perhaps in the U.S. but operating non-U.S. or non-Chinese capacity.
Exactly. They might offer a bit more predictability, less direct exposure to these specific fees going back and forth.
So are we talking about companies like ZIM, ZIM?
Xiamen could be one example, yeah. And maybe vessel lessors, too, like DAA, DAC.
But hang on, wouldn't those carriers just raise their rates anyway if demand shifts to them? Do shippers actually save money? Or is it just about avoiding the headache?
That's a fair point. It might not be purely about lower price. It's often more about predictability and stability. A shipper signing a long-term contract wants some assurance that their carrier won't suddenly get hit with a new government fee mid-contract.
Okay.
So booking with these, let's call them third-party carriers, offers a buffer against that direct geopolitical cost risk. It's risk management.
Right. Managing the risk itself has value. Okay, that makes sense. And the third category of winners, you mentioned those related U.S. tariffs earlier.
Yes, the U.S. port and logistics equipment makers. This is more straightforward. Well, the U.S. putting tariffs on Chinese-made ship-to-shore cranes and certain other big port equipment, it directly encourages buyers, like U.S. port authorities, to look elsewhere.
It makes the Chinese options more expensive or maybe just more complicated to buy.
Exactly. So it creates an incentive to buy from domestic manufacturers, or at least non-Chinese ones.
So this could drive demand towards U.S.-based companies that make this kind of heavy equipment.
Precisely. Companies like Tex, TEX, and NTW, MTW are positioned to potentially pick up orders that might have previously gone to Chinese suppliers.
Okay, so that covers potential beneficiaries. Now, let's look at the other side. Who faces more pressure from this? Let's talk about the losers.
All right, well, the most direct impact, obviously, is on the U.S. affiliated ocean carriers that actually serve the China routes.
They're the ones paying that new 400 yuan fee directly, right?
They are. They're writing the check when their ships call at Chinese ports, assuming they meet that ownership or operational criteria.
How much does that add up? Is that $56 per net ton a big deal on a large container ship?
Oh, it can be, yeah. A modern container ship has a huge net tonnage, tens of thousands sometimes. So even on a mid-sized vessel, you could be looking at, hundreds of thousands of dollars in extra costs for just one port call in China.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
remember that 25% ownership rule? It catches quite a few operators. So for carriers like MATX, MATX, or OSG, if they fit the criteria.
Right, if they have ships with that U.S. connection trading with China.
Yeah. They face a sudden jump in their operating costs on those routes. They either have to absorb that, which hurts their profits, or try to pass it on, which could make them less competitive on price.
Tough spot. Okay, who else feels the pinch?
Well, moving up the supply chain, you get to the companies actually importing the goods, the big box retailers, the e-commerce giants.
They're paying the freight bills, so ultimately the cost lands with them.
It often does, yeah. They might not pay the port fee directly to the Chinese government, but they'll likely see it reflected in freight surcharges from the carriers.
And it's not just a one-time price hike, is it? It's the instability.
That's a huge part of it. These two-way fees, U.S. and China, they make freight costs higher, yes, but also potentially more volatile. Supply chain managers at these big retailers, they rely on predictable transport costs to manage inventory, set prices, maintain margins, which are often pretty thin.
Yeah.
When shipping costs become unstable, it makes their job much harder. It can squeeze their profitability.
So we're talking about major importers like WMT,
WMT, TGT, AMZN. Companies heavily reliant on consistent, cost-effective imports from Asia. Any sustained increase or volatility in shipping costs is a headwind for them.
Makes sense. Okay, one more category on the potential losers list.
Yes, let's look inland. The railroads, specifically those heavily involved in moving containers from the ports.
The ones handling the port intermodal flows. Can you just quickly explain what that means for listeners?
Sure. Intermodal just means using multiple types of transport. In this case, the container comes off the ship,
Right.
gets loaded onto a train, often right there at the port terminal or nearby, for the long trip inland. That's the intermodal flow.
Okay, so how does a fee charged at the port affect a railroad maybe hundreds of miles away?
It's about the smoothness of the operation. If these fees, or just the confusion around them, cause ships to slow down their schedules, maybe wait longer offshore to avoid a charge window or reroute.
It creates delays at the port itself. Congestion.
Exactly. If ships aren't unloading on a regular, predictable schedule, then the containers aren't there to be loaded onto the trains on schedule.
The whole rhythm gets thrown off.
Precisely. The flow becomes irregular. That messes up scheduling for the railroads. They have trains, crews, track time, all planned based on expected container volumes. Disruptions mean inefficiency, and that costs money.
So this could affect the big rail operators, especially those serving the major coastal ports handling this trade, like UNP.
UNP, certainly, especially on the West Coast, and also potentially NSC, depending on the port flows.
Okay, so summing this all up then. These back-and-forth fees between the U.S. and China, they're adding costs, adding complexity to the whole trans-Pacific shipping system. And that pressure creates challenges for some. The U.S.-linked carriers, the big importers, potentially the railroads. But it also might create openings for others, like air freight or maybe those non-aligned ocean carriers.
That's a good summary. It shows how these policy actions, these fees, translate pretty directly into pressures and potential opportunities in the market.
Yeah, it's clear how even what seems like a relatively small fee, $50 or $56 per ton, adds up quickly.
Absolutely. When you apply that across thousands of voyages by these massive ships, you see how seemingly small policy tweaks can really exert tangible financial pressure across global supply chains.
So maybe a final thought for people listening. If governments are getting this specific, with fees basing them on ownership percentages and things like that, what does this signal for the future?
Yeah.
Will companies increasingly have to pick a side, geopolitically speaking?
That's certainly the big question executives are probably wrestling with right now. How do you navigate this increasingly complex landscape?
Indeed. Okay, before we wrap up, just the standard reminder. This discussion is not financial advice. It doesn't constitute buy or sell recommendations for any security. It's purely for informational purposes, reflecting the opinions of the speakers.
Thanks for the discussion today. It's a complex but important area to watch.
Absolutely. We hope this breakdown helps you understand the forces at play in global logistics right now. Thanks for tuning in to Breaking News to Trading Moves.